So we have implemented these login and logout features, but there is a problem with our implementation. Look at our app component. Here in component.mount, we are working with this item in the local storage. The key of this item is token, and we have repeated this in a few different places. So if you look at login form, here on line 25, again, we're accessing this item with the key token. The same goes for our logout component. Once again, we're working with this item with the key token. If tomorrow we decide to change this key to something else, there are multiple places in our application that we need to modify. Technically, we should have only a single module where we have the implementation of authentication. Anything about authentication should be implemented in that module. Now, currently, we do have a module for that. Let's take a look at auth service. So in this module, we only have a login method, and all we're doing here is sending an HTTP post request to the server. Ideally, we should move the logic of storing the token in the local storage or removing it inside of this auth service. So this way, this module will be the only module in our application where we know how authentication is implemented. Right now, this responsibility is scattered all over the place. A part of that is in our login form, another part is in our app component, and so on. So let's refactor this step by step. First, let's go to our login form. We should move this line into our auth service. So cut. Now back to our auth service. This is our login method. Here, instead of returning this promise, we need to await it to get the response. And from the response, we're going to get the data property and rename it to JWT. Now let's paste the line that we cut. So we send an HTTP request to the server, we get the token and store it in the local storage. Now, because we have used await here, we should mark this function as async. With this change, we can go back to our login form and simplify this implementation. We no longer need to extract the token from the response, so delete. That is better. Now, you might be curious why I didn't move this line in our login function. Because this is really outside the scope of logging in a user, what happens after is the responsibility of the consumer of this login function. Maybe in one component, we want to redirect the user to the home page after they're logged in, but in another component, we want to display a toast notification. So what happens after the user is logged in is not the responsibility of the login function, okay? Now let's go to our logout component. Here, we should cut this line for removing the token. Cut. Now, back to the auth service. We should export another function, call it logout. And here we simply remove the token from the local storage. That is better. With this, we go back to our logout component. On the top, we should import the logout function from services/auth service. And then here we'll simply call the logout function. What happens when the user log out is not the responsibility of this component. Maybe we should delete something from local storage. Maybe we should call the backend. What happens is the implementation detail. It should not be part of the logout component, okay? Now, I personally prefer to implement this in more of an object-oriented way. So instead of importing a function here, I would rather to import an object like auth, and then here call auth.logout. I personally prefer this syntax. To make this happen, we should go back to our auth service and export a default object. In this object, we'll add the login and logout functions. Okay. Now, similarly, we could go back to our login form on the top where we are importing our auth service. Instead of importing the login function, we import an object called auth, and then here we call auth.login. That is better. Now let's go to our app component. Similarly, we should move this logic to our auth service because this is the implementation detail of getting the current user. This app component shouldn't know where the token is stored or decode it. This is all about the detail. Ideally, app component should tell our auth service, hey, give me the current user. We either get a user object or null. As simple as that. We don't even need this try catch block here. So I'm going to cut this code from here, go to auth service, and create a new function. Call it get current user. Now paste this code. In this function, we have our try block. We get the token from the storage, we decode it, but we are not going to update the state because that's the responsibility of a component. So let's cut this line from here. If we can successfully decode this token, we get a user object. So we simply return that here. Otherwise, if we get an exception, we're going to return null. That means we don't have a current user. Now let's add this function to the default object that we're exporting here. Get current user. Save the changes. Back in app component, here we need to import our auth service. So right after we import all the components, we'll import any services that we need. In this case, auth from services/auth service. And then in component did mount, we call auth that get current user. We get a user object, which can be null, and then we'll call this .setState. Isn't that cleaner? It's much better. The details of getting the current user are not implemented here. They are somewhere else. Now, also, we should go on the top. We no longer need to import this function. In fact, our app component shouldn't really care about decoding a JSON web token. This is implementation detail about authentication. So all these details should be in our auth service. So we're going to cut this line from here and move it on top of our auth service. Finally, the last part that we need to refactor is our register form. Once again here, we are directly working with the local storage. We want to push this to our auth service. So we register a user using the user service, and then we need to tell our auth service to store the token. Currently, in our auth service, we have a login function or a login method that takes an email and password. We need another function or another method here that will log in the user using a JSON web token. So in that function, we're not going to call the server, we'll simply store the token. So let's export another function, call it login with JWT. We pass it JWT, and here we simply call local storage .setItem. Now we need to add this new function to the default object we are exporting. So login with JWT. Now technically we don't need to export these individual functions because we're exporting this default object and we can access any of these functions using this object. But we can keep them here in case we want to import only a single function in another module. So save the changes. Now back in our register form, on the top, we need to import our auth service. So import auth from services/auth service. Now you see we used a different syntax for importing a user service. That is a little bit ugly compared to how we're importing the auth service. So potentially in the future, we can modify this user service and export a default object so we don't have to add this extra part when importing this user service. For now, let's not worry about this. Back to our registration form. So here, instead of calling local storage .setItem, we should call auth.login with JWT. And we remove the first parameter. Good. So now if you look at our auth service, there is a single place where we're working with this local storage. If tomorrow we decide to rename this to something else, we only have to come back and modify this module. Now to make this code even better, we can replace all occurrences of this token with a constant. Let's call that constant token key. And then here we can initialize it on the top. Token key set to token. This way, this is not repeated 4 times in this module.